Right now, I mean, if you just walk down the street, you've probably noticed millions of people walking around with these small white patches on the back of their arms.
Oh, yeah. They're everywhere.
They really are. And it's kind of wild because those patches are literally predicting their future. It sounds like science fiction, but it's not.
No, it's very real. These little circular devices are essentially streaming high-definition data of human metabolism.
Mm.
And they're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Right. And while you might associate them purely with, daily diabetes management, their role is fundamentally shifting right before our eyes.
We are witnessing a profound evolution in medicine here. Those patches, continuous glucose monitors or CGMs, they're basically transforming into medical time machines.
Medical time machines, that is a great way to put it.
Yeah, because they're allowing us to spot the earliest whispers of metabolic dysfunction months or, even years before outward symptoms actually appear, while also just completely rewiring how healthcare systems manage chronic conditions altogether.
And that shift from a static management tool to a predictive engine, that is exactly our mission for this deep dive, to really understand the mechanics of how this is actually happening.
Right.
So we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of recent medical literature today. We're looking at a comprehensive 2026 review from Diabetology on early-stage type 1 diabetes.
A fantastic paper, yeah.
It really is. Plus, we have this massive real-world clinical study out of Andalusia, Spain, looking at how this tech impacts hospitalizations. And we're also digging into the GOLD trial, which introduces a totally new behavior-driven metric for measuring our health called the Glycemia Risk Index.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
There is. So, okay, let's unpack this. Starting with how type 1 diabetes actually develops in the human body, because honestly, the public perception is often a bit skewed. The old assumption for most people is that it's just, a switch that suddenly flips one day.
Yeah, and the reality is a much slower, almost invisible biological decline. We now understand that type 1 diabetes progresses through very distinct clinical stages. Stage 1 is this entirely silent phase. Your blood sugar is totally normal, but your immune system has started producing multiple autoantibodies.
Right. And just as a quick refresher for you listening, when we talk about autoantibodies, we're essentially talking about the body's friendly fire. The immune system gets confused and starts producing proteins that specifically target the body's own tissues.
Exactly.
Which in this case would be the insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas.
Right. That friendly fire is quietly drawing up battle plans in the dark.
Yeah.
And once 2 or more of those specific autoantibodies are present, the lifetime risk of progressing to a full clinical diagnosis approaches 100%.
Wow, 100%.
It's virtually guaranteed.
Yeah.
Then you move into stage 2, which is characterized by dysglycemia. So mild blood sugar abnormalities, but the person generally still feels perfectly fine.
Because the destruction is happening behind the scenes. By the time someone reaches stage 3, which is the symptomatic clinical diagnosis that, most people are familiar with, a massive percentage of those pancreatic beta cells have already been completely wiped out.
Right, they're just gone.
And if this decline is happening silently over months or even years, the obvious challenge is how we actually shine a light on it early enough to do something about it. Which brings us to the old standard. For decades, the medical gold standard for staging this process has been the oral glucose tolerance test, or OGTT.
Oh, the OGTT.
Yeah.
It is an incredibly burdensome protocol, particularly when you consider that this testing is frequently performed on young children.
Yeah, it sounds miserable.
It really is.
Yeah.
To administer it, the patient first has to go through days of preparatory carbohydrate loading at home.
Okay.
Then they undergo a strict fasting period. They arrive at a clinic, they have an IV cannula inserted, and they're asked to drink this very heavy, highly syrupy glucose solution. Yeah. And then over the next 2 hours, clinicians take multiple blood draws to see how the body handles that sudden spike in sugar.
So the physical toll is bad enough, but the Diabetology review points out something even more frustrating, which is that the data we get from all that misery is remarkably flawed.
Yes. Highly flawed.
For starters, those blood samples degrade incredibly quickly if they aren't processed immediately by the lab. But the wildest part to me is the sheer biological variability. The researchers looking at the TrialNet study data, they found that 36% of individuals who had an abnormal OGTT, meaning the test flagged them as being in immediate danger of progressing. They actually reverted back to totally normal blood sugar levels at their next assessment.
What's fascinating here is that the 36% reversion rate perfectly illustrates why a static test completely fails a dynamic disease.
Right.
Early-stage type 1 diabetes is not just a straight line downward. the body is constantly fighting back. The beta cells might get stressed by, say, a growth spurt or even just a standard viral
I'm
infection,
sure.
so they struggle. And the test looks terrible that day. Yeah. But then the stressor passes, the beta cells recover a bit of their function, and the next test looks fine.
It's like trying to predict the overall climate of a city by looking out your window once a day at exactly noon.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
I mean, if it happens to be raining at noon, you write down rainy climate. But you completely miss the bright sunshine at 10 a.m. and the snowstorm at 4 p.m. A CGM, on the other hand, is like strapping a 247 Doppler weather radar to your arm.
Right. It watches every single storm cell forming, moving, and dissipating in real time.
Right.
And getting that Doppler radar data is no longer just an academic pursuit either. It is literally the key to entirely new therapies.
Like what?
Well, we are now seeing the approval of revolutionary disease-modifying drugs, like teplizumab. These drugs can actually delay the onset of stage 3 clinical diabetes.
Wow, so you can actually push back the diagnosis.
Yes, but the catch is that you can only deploy a drug to delay the disease if you know exactly when the patient's metabolism is actually starting to accelerate toward failure.
Right, the timing is everything. So if the OGTT is that clunky, unreliable daily snapshot, and the CGM is the continuous radar, researchers are now combing through oceans of this continuous data, trying to find, basically, a diagnostic tripwire.
Exactly. They want a specific number that reliably predicts the future.
And a lot of these studies point to a very specific danger zone, which is spending time with glucose levels above 7.8 millimoles per liter.
Yeah, the literature continuously circles back to 7.8 millimoles per liter, or occasionally 10.0 millimoles per liter after a large meal. But the core unresolved question that is just driving the whole field right now is determining exactly how much time spent above that 7.8 threshold actually signals that the pancreas is failing.
And the consensus seems surprisingly fractured on this. I mean, the TrialNet cohort suggested that spending just 5% of your time above 7.8 was enough to predict imminent progression to stage 3.
Right.
But then current international consensus guidelines lean toward defining stage 2 as spending 10% or more of your time above 7.8 and stage 3 as 20% or more.
Yeah, and that fractured consensus reveals a much deeper problem about human biology, which researchers just call heterogeneity. We're essentially trying to draw a hard mathematical line across a profoundly diverse human population.
Right, and I have to push back a little here on the 7.8 rule. Think about your own daily life. Can we really apply a blanket threshold of 7.8 to every single person?
It's tough.
What if someone who is perfectly healthy just ate a massive plate of pasta? Or, what if they're just getting older? Our insulin sensitivity naturally shifts over time. Using a strict 10% rule feels like we might accidentally diagnose a completely healthy pasta lover with early-stage autoimmune disease.
I mean, you're right, and the data completely validates that concern. A recent large-scale analysis demonstrated that perfectly healthy individuals under the age of 60 without obesity naturally spend about 10% of their day above that 7.8 threshold anyway.
Wait, really? Just a normal baseline?
Just normal baseline. Their bodies process the food, the glucose rises, the insulin does its job, and it comes back down. It's totally fine. And as we age, our physiological insulin sensitivity declines naturally, meaning a healthy 70-year-old might spend even more time above that line simply due to age, not because of autoimmune destruction.
Okay, so we have the high-definition technology to see every single fluctuation, but we don't fully possess the baseline map to interpret it perfectly across every demographic yet.
Exactly. We're still mapping normal.
So if the baseline for healthy individuals is still that murky, what happens when we look at people whose metabolism is already undeniably struggling? Like the people who are already living in full-blown stage 3.
Right. This is where the technology stops being just a predictive model for the future and becomes a profound real-time intervention for today. The clinical study from Andalusia, Spain, gives us an incredible window into this.
Yeah, let's get into the Spain study because it's huge. They tracked 13,616 adults with established type 1 diabetes who adopted intermittently scanned CGMs. So this is the version where the user actively taps their smartphone or a reader against the patch to pull the current data and see the trend arrows. And the researchers specifically looked at the impact this tech had on hospitalizations for diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA.
And DKA is the absolute nightmare scenario in diabetes management. When the body lacks sufficient insulin, the cells begin to literally starve for energy, even if the blood is absolutely full of sugar.
Right.
So to survive, the body starts rapidly breaking down fat for fuel. This emergency metabolic pathway produces these acidic byproducts called ketones.
Which is very dangerous.
Oh, extremely. If left unchecked, the blood itself turns acidic, leading to severe organ damage, coma, and potentially death. It is the exact kind of catastrophic emergency the healthcare system spends an absolute fortune trying to manage.
But the ambient monitoring of a CGM fundamentally breaks that catastrophic cascade. Because after adopting the sensors, DKA hospitalizations across this massive Spanish population were essentially cut in half.
Cut in half, it's amazing.
They plummeted from about 79 admissions per 10,000 person years down to just over 40.
And the mechanism behind that drop is entirely behavioral. It's incredible. Instead of a patient waiting until they feel nauseous or they're vomiting and rushing to the ER when their blood is already dangerously acidic, they just tap their phone.
Right.
They see their glucose is climbing rapidly. They take a small corrective dose of insulin, drink some water, and just monitor the trend. They interrupt the physiological chain reaction hours before it ever escalates into a medical crisis.
And what stuck out to me was who actually benefited the most. The biggest drops in hospitalizations were seen in the highest risk patients. The ones whose historical 3-month blood sugar averages their HbA1c levels were the highest prior to using the tech.
Exactly.
So this isn't just optimizing people who already have great control. It is throwing a massive lifeline to the people who were struggling the hardest.
And throwing that lifeline creates a massive economic ripple effect. In just 1 year, for this single regional healthcare system in Andalusia, having those DKA admissions resulted in an estimated direct cost savings of over 782,000 euros.
Over 782,000 euros.
Yeah.
In one region. So what does this all mean for the future of medicine? If a little piece of plastic on the arm prevents a biological crisis, keeps human beings out of the ICU, and saves nearly €1 million, you have to ask why this isn't just the absolute immediate universal starting point for all chronic care everywhere.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the friction isn't just about the initial cost of buying the sensors. It's that global healthcare systems has spent the last century optimizing for reactive emergency treatment.
Oh,
The entire infrastructure, the billing codes, the standard 15-minute doctor appointments, the hospital triages, it's all built for people who are already sick. A CGM forces the system to pivot to proactive ambient monitoring.
which is a totally different model.
Completely different. Doctors suddenly need infrastructure to review data between appointments. Patients need education on how to actually interpret those trend arrows. But the Andalusia study proves that once you build that proactive infrastructure, the human and financial returns are staggering.
But measuring the success of that proactive care on a day-to-day basis is where things get surprisingly complex. It's not just about keeping someone out of the emergency room, right? It's about the daily, granular quality of life. And this brings us to the GOLD trial, which introduces a metric called the Glycemia Risk Index, or GRI.
Right. Because historically, clinicians focus heavily on a metric called time and range, which is simply calculating what percentage of the 24-hour day a patient's blood sugar stayed between two healthy lines. It's a useful baseline, but it has a really dangerous blind spot.
Because time and range treats a slight dip the exact same way it treats a terrifying immediate crash. It doesn't measure the severity of the excursion.
Precisely. The Glycemia Risk Index was designed to fix that. It is a composite mathematical metric on a scale of 0 to 100, and the formula heavily, almost exponentially, weighs the extremes. The severe highs, known as hyperglycemia, and the severe lows, hypoglycemia.
So think of time and range as just knowing your car is generally on the highway. It's good to know, but it doesn't tell you how you're driving. The Glycemia Risk Index tells you exactly how close you are to violently scraping the guardrails on either side of the road.
I love that analogy, because scraping the guardrails is what damages the body and causes the daily, just utter exhaustion of the disease. In the GOLD trial, which followed 125 adults transitioning from traditional finger prick blood tests to CGMs, the switch caused their average GRI to drop by nearly 10 units.
That's a huge drop.
It is. Over 85% of the users either maintained or improved their overall risk zone. The GRI proved to be incredibly sensitive to showing actual meaningful improvements in their daily safety.
But honestly, the biology wasn't even the most interesting part of the GOLD trial to me. It was the psychology. Because the researchers surveyed the participants' personality traits to see what correlated with better GRI scores. Now, it makes sense that people who self-reported as having high thoroughness saw massive reductions in dangerous low blood sugars.
Yeah.
But there was one trait linked to worse outcomes that seems completely counterintuitive to me. Having prior formal training in carbohydrate counting. Wait, if they are formally trained carb counters, are they just hyper fixating on the data, like getting this constant stream of numbers and driving themselves crazy, trying to micromanage every slight fluctuation?
You nailed the mechanism perfectly. It is a classic, heavily documented case of alarm fatigue and over-tinkering. You would assume that giving highly detailed nutritional education to someone with high-definition data would create a perfect metabolic loop
But instead, more education actually led to smaller improvements.
because of the psychological burden. If you have been rigorously trained to calculate the exact carbohydrate impact of a single cracker, and suddenly a sensor is giving you a new glucose reading every 5 minutes, the temptation to react to every minor shift is overwhelming.
I could totally see that.
Right, you see a slight upward trend, you administer a tiny bit of insulin, you correct too aggressively, and the number starts dropping. Now you have to eat sugar to fix the crash you just caused. You end up riding a metabolic roller coaster entirely of your own making, fueled just by the anxiety of having too much information.
It is the ultimate proof that the most sophisticated medical hardware in the world still relies entirely on the flawed, beautiful, highly anxious human brain operating it.
Absolutely. And this raises an important question about how regulatory bodies view this technology. With all of this undeniable real-world evidence, predicting autoimmune failure, cutting hospitalizations, optimizing the daily guardrails, agencies like the FDA in the United States and the EMA in Europe are still remarkably hesitant to accept CGM data as a primary endpoint for early-stage clinical trials.
Yeah, they are still demanding the old, clunky benchmarks. They want to see changes in HbA1c or measurements of C-peptide, which is just a byproduct the body makes when it produces insulin, proving the pancreas is still basically working. Why are the regulators dragging their feet on new tech?
Well, the regulatory agencies are actually making a scientifically valid point here. The technology is miraculous, but the foundational mechanics of how a CGM gathers data introduces a critical margin of error. A continuous glucose monitor does not actually measure your blood.
This is such an important distinction to
It
explain.
really is. The tiny sensor wire inserted under the skin is actually measuring the glucose concentration in the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that bathes and surrounds your cells.
Right. So think of your bloodstream as a fast-moving, multi-lane highway. The interstitial fluid is the network of local side streets running parallel to it. When you eat, the glucose hits the highway first. Eventually, that traffic diffuses and spills over into the local side streets. But there is a biological delay.
Yes, that diffusion takes time. If a patient's glucose is rising or falling rapidly, the CGM is essentially reporting the news from 5 to 15 minutes ago.
Interesting.
Now, for daily management, like knowing if you need to eat a snack before a workout, that lag is perfectly acceptable. But if you are a pharmaceutical company running a trial, trying to prove your new drug fundamentally preserves beta cell function at a microscopic level, that 15-minute lag introduces unacceptable noise into the data.
And the diabetology paper highlights that the noise isn't just biological, it's chemical too. These sensors can literally be hijacked by common over-the-counter medicine.
Oh, easily. Most of these sensors utilize glucose oxidase-based electrochemistry. Simply put, the tiny wire under the skin is coated in an enzyme. When that enzyme reacts with glucose, it produces a tiny electrical current. The device reads the strength of that current and translates it into a number on your screen. However, common compounds like paracetamol, Tylenol, or high doses of vitamin C can oxidize directly at the electrode.
So they basically throw rogue electrons into the system, artificially inflating the electrical current. The sensor misinterprets that chemical interference as a massive blood sugar spike.
Exactly.
Add to that the fact that you can have a greater than 5% accuracy bias between two sensors of the exact same brand right out of the box, and suddenly the FDA's demand for standardization makes total sense.
It really does. But here's where it gets really interesting, though. The hesitation from the medical community isn't solely about electrochemistry. It actually returns to that psychological burden we talked about. The review discusses the sheer anxiety of ambient monitoring, especially for parents whose children are in stage 1 or stage 2.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You are taking a child who is playing outside, feeling completely fine, but who tested positive for the autoantibodies, and you are literally strapping a medical alarm to their arm.
Right. And there is an ongoing debate right now in the clinical trial community about whether these participants should be blinded or unblinded. Should the families be allowed to look at their phones and see the numbers? Or should the device act as a black box, just quietly collecting data for the researchers?
And what do the families want?
Well, in one of the studies analyzed, 35% of the participants practically begged the researchers to unblind their screens, They knew the data was being collected on their own bodies or their children's bodies, and the not knowing became totally unbearable.
Wow.
We naturally crave data because we want the illusion of control. But watching a line graph of your child's metabolism fluctuate 24 hours a day can quickly strip that illusion away, replacing it with chronic anxiety. It demands a level of psychological support that our healthcare system is just not currently equipped to provide at scale.
The paradox of modern medical tech. The more invisible and ambient the hardware gets, the louder and more disruptive the psychological alarms become in our daily lives. So let's bring all these threads together.
Let's do it.
We started by redefining type 1 diabetes, moving away from those awful, nauseating OGTT drinks and utilizing continuous monitors to spot the biological decline before the pancreas is wiped out. We saw the profound systemic power of this in Andalusia, where breaking the behavioral loop cut DKA hospitalizations in half.
Huge win.
Huge. We unpacked the glycemia risk index and the irony that over-educating yourself on carbs can sometimes backfire into over-tinkering. And we've looked at the very real chemical and psychological hurdles keeping the FDA cautious.
We are squarely in the messy, complicated middle of a massive medical paradigm shift.
We really are. And for you listening, even if you don't have diabetes, even if you've never worn a sensor, this deep dive is a direct window into the future of your own healthcare. The model is moving away from the episodic snapshot, the once-a-year blood draw or physical, and moving toward continuous personalized data streams. The white patch on the arm is just the opening act.
Which actually leads to a final, incredibly provocative thought to leave you with today. The Diabetologia Review notes that researchers are already looking past the simple numbers and trend arrows. They're using machine learning to analyze what they call decomposed CGM traces.
Decomposed traces, meaning they aren't just looking to see if you crossed that 7.8 threshold we talked about earlier.
Right, exactly. The AI is looking at the overall functional shape of your glucose curve over the span of weeks. It is essentially mapping the actual geometry of your metabolism. And the AI can already spot hidden, underlying insulin resistance based purely on the shape of those curves, long before any traditional lab test would ever flag a problem.
So imagine a future one that is approaching very quickly, by the way, where this continuous stream of our metabolic geometry is cross-referenced with our genetic profiles, our wearable fitness trackers, our sleep data. What happens to medicine then?
Everything changes.
Could the very definition of what we call a disease become entirely predictive? Will an AI look at the shape of your ambient data today and diagnose you with a condition decades before that condition even has a formal medical name?
We started out by calling these devices medical time machines. And it turns out they aren't just predicting the weather of our health. They are fundamentally redrawing the entire map of human biology.
Something to think about the next time you see that little white patch in the checkout line.